opening the path for the queen and king's bishop. This move immediately contests the center and invites an active game. Instantly establishing a fight for central squares, black steers the game towards complex strategic skirmishes. Preparing d4 control, this solidifies the center but postpones immediate central confrontation. Smashing the center pawn immediately challenges white's flank advance, aiming to seize central space. Opening that central file immediately offers dynamic play, forcing black to react to the unleashed diagonal. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately activates her, eyeing the king's side and potentially centralizing play. Opening up the center now is a bold bid for central space and attacking potential. Developing the knight here is a natural step, securing the pawn and preparing to castle while also contesting the center. Developing this knight effectively challenges the queen's influence, seizing central territory and preparing for a more dynamic kingside game. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for the knight's development, this move gracefully opens a diagonal for the bishop. Securing the center's stability, this bishop prepares to join the kingside assault, eyeing the dark squares. Exposing the d4 pawn to recapture opens critical lines and dictates piece activity. Reclaiming the center allows white to develop quickly and press for kingside initiative. Developing a piece to a more active square, aiming for central control and preparing for kingside castling while maintaining piece harmony. Developing this knight swiftly contests central squares and prepares for castling. Retreating the queen here surrenders valuable central influence and tempo, creating a passive position. Developing this bishop aims to seize control of the long diagonal and pressure black's uncastled king. Developing knights to their natural squares creates excellent attacking potential for black. Securing the monarch opens up lines for attack and supports development, a prudent defensive maneuver. Jumping the knight to d5 creates immediate tension, eyeing both the pawn on c3 and aiming to exchange, which could relieve some of black's cramped position. Trading the bishop clarifies the central pawn structure and simplifies the position, potentially leading to a quieter game. Reclaiming the pawn with your queen now establishes a symmetrical pawn structure, offering solidity but potentially limiting queen mobility for the moment. Unleashing the queen, white aims to exploit the slightly exposed black king and control open lines. Securing the monarch amidst the central storm is a prudent priority, especially with lines potentially opening. Recapturing the pawn consolidates material, but opens the queen's diagonal for black's potential pieces. The bishop's repositioning effectively challenges white's queen and eyes the kingside. Securing the open d-file, this rook proactively prepares for potential pawn advances and pressures black's queenside. Challenging the queen's influence, this knight boldly seeks active squares, aiming to disrupt white's queenside plans and potentially fork pieces. Asserting dominion over the central open file, this move prepares to contest key squares and pressure black's potentially isolated queen's knight. Unpinning the knight and freeing the queen's path to the queenside offers crucial counterplay. A subtle repositioning of the queen, aiming to support the kingside advance and potentially create threats along the a2-g8 diagonal. Reclaiming the central pawn is a priority, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement. Exploiting the pin and opening lines towards the exposed king offers a dynamic path forward. Re-establishing the bishop's defensive posture on a safe diagonal, this maneuver conserves energy for future skirmishes. Seizing the open d-file and preparing to attack the weakened kingside pawn structure is the immediate goal. Liberating the rook from its pawn shield, this piece now actively contests the open c-file and eyes the queenside. This move establishes a positional bind by exploiting the open d-file and pressuring black's queenside coordination. A bold foray, venturing the knight into enemy territory, challenging the bishop and creating immediate tactical crossroads. Unlocking the c-file, but potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to b6 aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the undefended pawn. Bolstering the kingside before potentially committing the knight forward to control central squares is a prudent step. Trading off the active bishop simplifies the position, potentially leading to a more manageable endgame for black. Recapturing the pawn opens a diagonal for your queen, creating pressure on black's queenside pawns. The queen retreats, sacrificing tempo but securing a crucial outpost for the knight. Trading queens here relinquishes initiative, potentially simplifying into a slightly worse pawn structure for white. Reopening the g-file offers attacking possibilities, but it also exposes your king's structure significantly. Repositioning the knight to the center shores up potential pawn weaknesses. The pawn structure now resembles a broken ladder, potentially creating isolated pawns for white and opening files for counterplay. Restructuring the knight's position aims to secure it against future pawn advances and prepare for a more active central role. Focusing on king safety, this maneuver aims to free the monarch from its current exposed position. Reasserting central control and preparing for potential pawn pushes, this knight redeploys to a more active square, eyeing weaknesses. Repositioning the bishop to f5 aims to activate it and challenge white's control over the central dark squares. Fortifying the kingside pawns allows white to consolidate their position and prepare for future action. Refocusing the king towards safety, preparing to activate the rook on the d-file now that the pawn structure has stabilized somewhat. Finally, activating the monarch. This brings the king into the fray, potentially bolstering defense or aiming for a more active endgame role. Rearranging pieces to consolidate the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Aggressively advancing the g-pawn aims to seize space, but weakens the kingside significantly, potentially opening avenues for black's pieces. Reclaiming open files is paramount. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and activate black's rooks. This maneuver aims to secure the knight's position and prepare its redeployment to a more active square. Reclaiming the open file offers immediate counterplay, forcing white to defend their isolated pawns. Reclaiming the central file solidifies control and opens pathways for pawn advancement. The rook exchange simplifies the position, ushering in a more strategic phase centered on pawn structure and active piece placement for the coming endgame battle. Recapturing the rook opens up the c-file, allowing your knights to enter the fray and support a potential pawn advance. The bishop on b1 is now a passive observer, stranded by the pawn chain and lacking any active influence. A bold king sortie, aiming to reactivate the monarch into the fray while accepting some risk. Focusing the king towards the center is a common endgame principle, aiming to activate it as a fighting piece while preparing for the pawn storm to come. The king abandons its safe haven, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. Solidifying the king's foothold amidst this endgame, aiming to anchor the monarch against potential infiltration. This pawn thrust aims to gain queenside space and hinder black's rook activity. The knight's repositioning to d7 prepares to challenge white's advanced pawns and potentially reroute to a more active square. Repositioning the knight to a more active square aims to control central squares and potentially threaten black's isolated pawns. Rethinking piece placement, the knight aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially eye the kingside. Provoking a weakness on the kingside, this pawn advance seeks to exploit the cramped black knight. Reclaiming central square control, the knight aims to disrupt white's advancing pawn structure and potentially harass the beleaguered king. Opening up the knight's diagonal to potentially target the king's defenses feels like a strategic gamble. The bishop seeks active squares, aiming to pressure the queenside pawns from its new outpost. Seeking to consolidate the knight on a more active square, preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Securing the queenside pawns prevents immediate breakthroughs and prepares for potential queenside expansion later. Expanding along the queenside aims to create new play and disrupt black's cramped position. Injecting aggression into the pawn structure, black aims to disrupt white's coordination and create counterplay on the kingside. Doubling pawns across the fifth rank asserts dominance, threatening to splinter black's defensive structure. A strategic retreat to the edge of the board, the bishop patiently awaits an opportune moment to disrupt white's pawn structure. Seeking active squares for its knight, this maneuver aims to reposition for central influence or potential flank pressure. Targeting the now exposed white king by bringing the knight into an attacking posture offers active counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens a critical diagonal for your queen, creating immediate mating threats. A desperate bid for counterplay, aiming to unleash the knight's activity against white's exposed king. Securing the kingside pawns against further infiltration is paramount now. The bishop vacates the defense of its pawn, opening a pathway for white's knight to potentially infiltrate the kingside. Repositioning the knight to create potential outposts and prevent pawn advances seems to be the intent. Black seeks to reignite activity on the queenside, aiming to exploit the open lines and potentially create counterplay against white's advanced pawns. Extending the flank aggressively, aiming to restrict black's pieces and gain a pawn majority. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, aiming to open lines for the bishop. Capturing the pawn with check forces a king escape, opening lines for white's pieces. The black king cautiously steps out, seeking refuge from the attacking knights. Unleashing a knight check, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the king's precarious central placement. Now that white has forced the capture of the knight, black must focus on regrouping and coordinating his remaining pieces to exploit the weakened king position. Seizing the open file, the knight aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exploit weaknesses. Clearing the path for the knight to occupy a more active central square is a sound strategic idea here. This knight maneuvers to a central outpost, eyeing the vulnerable pawns and offering support to its own king. Snatching that pawn creates a tactical minefield, potentially opening lines for your king's defense or exposing your opponent's pieces. Sacrificing material to infiltrate the enemy king's defense with the knight opens up decisive lines. Sacrificing material to expose the king rarely pays off long-term. Expanding the queenside pawns now allows the king to become more active while the knight seeks better squares. Sacrificing the knight for a moment of initiative, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create chaos. Securing the king's dominion becomes paramount with this relocation, aiming to restrict the opponent's advanced pawn. Snatching that knight on g5 is a bold gamble, but it opens up possibilities for immediate threats against the exposed white king. Unleashing the passed pawn, the d-pawn becomes a potent weapon, forcing black's pieces to react defensively and limiting their counterplay. The bishop vacates its post, allowing the knight a chance to penetrate deeper into white's territory. Unleashing the pawn's final advance, the endgame king is exposed. The king, now exposed after sacrificing pawns, faces immediate and unavoidable mating threats. The knight's powerful thrust forces the king's retreat, preparing to infiltrate black's weakened queenside. The king must now sprint to safety, as the d-pawn's unstoppable march creates immediate danger. Sacrificing material to expose black's king offers a direct path to victory. The knight's check creates a crucial tempo, forcing the king to shift and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure defense. King activation is paramount now, seizing central squares to pressure black's advanced pawns and create threats. King's desperate attempt to evade perpetual threats, but the pawn chains remain a significant obstacle. Unleashing the knight to check forces black's king to an exposed position, setting up a decisive material gain. The knight's royal escort is crucial now. Keeping it safe allows the king to finally seek sanctuary. Sacrificing the knight opens a critical diagonal for the pawn, aiming to break through the defender's ranks. A significant pawn structure shift, creating a passed pawn on the d-file for white while black aims to leverage their own pawn majority. A crucial tempo gain, establishing control over the critical dark squares and threatening to annex the remaining pawns.